By 2011, Muammar Gaddafi had ruled Libya for over 40 years. He had outlasted coups, international sanctions, and multiple wars. But in the last months of his life, everything changed. Libya erupted in violence. Cities turned into battlegrounds. And for Gaddafi, the end came not in a palace or courtroom, but on the ground, bloodied and surrounded. Muammar Mohammed Abu Minyar al-Gaddafi was born in 1942 in a desert camp near the town of Sirte, Libya. He came from a poor Bedouin family. As a young man, he joined the military and studied in Libya, and later in the United Kingdom. In 1969, at just 27 years old, he led a bloodless coup against King Idris and took control of the country. From that moment, Gaddafi ruled Libya with a firm grip. He got rid of the monarchy, closed U.S. and British military bases, and nationalized the oil industry. He created his own political system called the Jamahiriya, which he claimed gave power to the people. But in reality, he kept all the power himself. During the 1970s and 80s, Gaddafi was known around the world for his radical ideas and support for armed groups in other countries. He was blamed for terror attacks, including the 1988 bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland, which killed 270 people. Because of this, Libya faced heavy international sanctions for years. But Gaddafi also tried to present himself as a Pan-African and Pan-Arab leader. He pushed for unity among African countries and wanted to be seen as a strong voice against the West. By the 2000s, he had started to soften his image. He gave up weapons programs, reopened ties with Western nations, and tried to rebuild Libya's economy. Still, inside Libya, many people were angry. They lived under tight control. Political parties were banned. Freedom of speech didn't exist. Corruption was everywhere. The wealth from oil mostly stayed in the hands of the elite. Gaddafi and his family lived in luxury, while many Libyans struggled. So when protests broke out in February 2011, it wasn't surprising that so many people joined in. In Benghazi, the second largest city in Libya, the unrest came right after similar uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt had forced their leaders out. This wave of resistance across the region became known as the Arab Spring. In Libya, it began on February 15th, when families of political prisoners gathered outside a police station to demand the release of human rights lawyer Fatih Terbil. He had been arrested earlier that day for speaking out about the 1996 Abu Salim prison massacre, where over 1,200 inmates were killed by Gaddafi's security forces. The protest quickly gained momentum. By February 17th, which became known as the Day of Rage, thousands of Libyans filled the streets in Benghazi, Baida, Tobruk, and Derna. They were angry about years of dictatorship, poverty, and repression. Instead of allowing peaceful demonstrations, security forces, including the feared Internal Security Agency and revolutionary committees, opened fire. Reports from hospitals confirmed that over 230 people were killed within 4 days. Many were shot in the chest and head, indicating the use of live ammunition against unarmed crowds. Rather than calm the situation, Gaddafi's government sent in more troops and ordered snipers to fire on protesters from rooftops. State media claimed the uprising was caused by foreign agents and drugged youths. Gaddafi's son, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, appeared on TV warning of civil war and threatened that rivers of blood would flow if the protests didn't stop. But the crackdown only pushed more people to resist. By the end of February, key military units began to defect. In Benghazi, elements of the army refused to shoot civilians. The 36th Brigade, led by Major General Suleiman Mahmoud, turned against the regime and helped rebels seize control of the city. Several government buildings were burned, police stations were overrun, weapons were taken. By February 24th, most of eastern Libya was no longer under Gaddafi's control. Cities like Tobruk, Misrata, Baida, and Zawiya also saw fierce clashes. Protesters armed themselves with rifles looted from army bases. Some of Gaddafi's Air Force pilots refused to bomb cities and instead flew their planes to Malta to seek asylum. The opposition soon organized into a loose leadership known as the National Transitional Council. formed officially on February 27th in Benghazi. Led by former Justice Minister Mustafa Abdul Jalil, the NTC claimed to represent the revolutionary forces and began planning a new Libya without Gaddafi. Meanwhile, Gaddafi held on to Tripoli and surrounding areas in the west. His forces included elite units like the Kamis Brigade, led by his son Kamis Gaddafi, who had access to tanks and artillery. The regime also hired foreign mercenaries from countries like Chad, Mali, and Niger to suppress protests. By early March 2011, the situation had reached a critical point. Gaddafi's forces were using heavy weapons, tanks, and air power to retake rebel-held cities. Civilians were being bombed, especially in eastern areas like Benghazi and Ajdabiya. International news showed graphic images of civilian neighborhoods destroyed by shelling. The fear was growing that Gaddafi would carry out a massacre if he reached Benghazi. On March 12th, the Arab League held an emergency meeting and called for a no-fly zone over Libya. This was important because it gave regional support to any outside intervention. The same week, France and the United Kingdom pushed the United Nations to act. On March 17, 2011, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1973, with 10 votes in favor and 5 abstentions, including Russia and China. The resolution authorized the use of all necessary measures to protect civilians, including a no-fly zone. It also banned all flights in Libyan airspace that could be used for military purposes and called for an immediate ceasefire. Just 2 days later, on March 19th, airstrikes began. The operation was first led by a coalition that included the United States, France, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Italy. The first missiles struck Gaddafi's air defense systems, radar stations, and military communication centers. Over 110 Tomahawk cruise missiles were launched from U.S. and British warships in the Mediterranean. French fighter jets also destroyed tanks advancing towards Benghazi. The coalition's military action was called Operation Odyssey Dawn. Its goal was to stop Gaddafi from attacking civilians, especially in areas where rebels were resisting. On March 23rd, NATO took full command of all military operations under a new mission named Operation Unified Protector. The alliance included 28 NATO members and non-NATO partners like Qatar, the UAE, and Jordan. The air campaign quickly destroyed a large portion of Gaddafi's military infrastructure. His MiG-23 fighter jets, Sukhoi bombers, and military air bases were hit. NATO also targeted long-range rocket launchers, supply convoys, and command centers. Within the first 2 weeks, dozens of tanks and armored vehicles were wiped out, especially near Misrata and Zintan. At sea, NATO enforced an arms embargo and blocked weapons shipments from reaching Gaddafi's forces. NATO warships patrolled Libya's coastline and stopped vessels suspected of carrying military supplies. Despite the damage to his military, Gaddafi remained defiant. He continued to speak to the public through state television, accusing NATO of trying to colonize Libya. He called the rebels rats and traitors, and promised to cleanse the country street by street. He also accused foreign powers of stealing Libyan oil and interfering in his internal affairs. His regime attempted to shoot down NATO planes using Russian-made surface-to-air missiles, but they failed to stop the air raids. By mid-2011, the situation on the ground had shifted in favor of the rebels, with NATO continuing to target Gaddafi's supply routes, weapons depots, and command centers. His military forces were stretched thin. Rebel groups from the Western Mountains, the Misrata Front, and eastern Libya started to close in on the capital from different directions. On August 20th, 2011, the rebels launched Operation Mermaid Dawn, their final assault on Tripoli. It was a coordinated plan that included fighters who had been secretly smuggled into the city earlier. These local fighters rose up from inside the capital while armed convoys advanced from outside. Over the next 5 days, heavy clashes erupted across the city. The neighborhoods of Tajura, Fashloum, and Souk al-Juma saw intense fighting. Loyalist forces tried to hold their ground using snipers and tanks, but they were overwhelmed by the speed of the rebel advance. Many Gaddafi soldiers either surrendered or abandoned their positions. On August 23rd, the rebels overran Bab al-Azizia, Gaddafi's heavily guarded compound in central Tripoli. This place had been the heart of his rule for over 4 decades. It was fortified with concrete walls, bunkers, and underground tunnels. Inside the compound, rebels found luxury items, weapons, documents, and signs that Gaddafi had left in a hurry. But the man himself was gone. By the time Tripoli was falling, Gaddafi had already fled. Intelligence reports suggested that he had left the city before the final attack began, likely around August 19th or 20th. He was believed to be moving between various safe houses with the help of loyal tribal networks. His family was also on the move. On August 29th, his wife Safia Farkash, daughter Aisha, and sons Hannibal and Mohammed crossed the border into Algeria, where they were granted temporary refuge. Another son, Saadi Gaddafi, later fled to Niger, where he was detained by authorities. But Gaddafi himself chose not to leave Libya. He believed that abandoning the country would mean total defeat. Instead, he decided to hide in areas still under the control of loyalist tribes, especially around his hometown, Sirte. Located along the Mediterranean coast, about 450 kilometers from Tripoli and 570 kilometers from Benghazi, Sirte had deep personal meaning for him. It wasn't just his hometown. It was a city he had built up during his time in power with modern buildings, wide roads, and government offices. He had even hosted African Union summits there, and once called for Sirte to be the capital of a United States of Africa. Gaddafi reached Sirte in early September 2011, accompanied by a shrinking number of loyalists. Most were close aides, bodyguards, and fighters from the Kadhafa tribe, his own tribe, which had a strong influence in the area. 2 of his sons, Muammar Gaddafi, a military commander, and Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, his political heir, were also believed to be moving between hideouts in and around the city. With Tripoli gone, Sirte became Gaddafi's last holdout. He was cut off from the rest of the country. Communications were limited. Supplies were running low. But he was not ready to leave Libya or surrender. By the second week of September, forces from the National Transitional Council began surrounding Sirte. The NTC, now recognized by many countries as Libya's official government, had sent thousands of fighters from different brigades to take the city. Units from Misrata, Benghazi, and Zintan approached from the east and west. Their goal was to capture Gaddafi and take full control of the country. The rebels expected a quick battle, but Sirte proved difficult. Loyalist fighters, including snipers and artillery units, had taken defensive positions throughout the city. They used civilian buildings like homes, schools, and hospitals for cover. The streets were booby-trapped. Landmines and improvised explosive devices were planted along major roads. Starting in mid-September, the NTC began heavy shelling of the city. Grad rockets, mortars, and tank fires hit buildings every day. NATO aircraft also bombed key targets, including bunkers and command centers. Civilians tried to flee, but many were stuck inside. The city's infrastructure began to collapse. Inside Sirte, Gaddafi and his group kept moving between abandoned homes and underground bunkers to avoid detection. He no longer had a clear command structure. Loyalist morale was low, but Gaddafi still gave orders to keep resisting. His son Muammar remained in charge of the city's defenses and coordinated the last efforts to push back the advancing forces. By late September, Sirte was completely surrounded. The NTC controlled the outskirts and began a slow, block-by-block advance. Sniper fire and street battles made progress slow and deadly. Hundreds of fighters were killed on both sides. NATO planes flew overhead constantly, searching for any signs of Gaddafi's whereabouts. Drones and surveillance jets were tracking heat signatures and radio signals. Because of this, Gaddafi ordered his group to avoid using phones, radios, or any electronic equipment. Their few satellite phones were rarely turned on, and they mostly relied on human messengers or runners who moved through the city on foot to carry messages between hideouts. Electricity and water were cut off. The group depended on canned goods, dry rations, and what little could be gathered from damaged stores or brought in by loyal civilians who remained in the city. There were no proper medical supplies. Wounded fighters were treated with basic tools, and antibiotics were in short supply. Gaddafi's group also suffered from hunger, dehydration, and illness due to poor conditions. By this time, around 200 fighters still remained loyal to him. Most were from his own tribe and came from Sirte or nearby towns. These men guarded Gaddafi closely and formed a small convoy around him whenever they moved. Abu Bakr Yunus Jaber, Libya's longtime defense minister, was also with them. These men were the last of his inner circle. Eyewitnesses and later reports confirmed that Gaddafi's health had begun to decline. He had lost weight, looked pale and exhausted, and was no longer the strong, confident figure seen on Libyan television. His beard had grown longer and whiter. He was said to be suffering from high blood pressure, mild diabetes, and stress-related problems. But despite everything, he remained firm in his decision to not surrender or leave Libya unless forced. He also remained silent to the outside world. After Tripoli fell, Gaddafi stopped broadcasting public messages. Unlike earlier in the war when he appeared regularly on state TV, he now avoided cameras altogether. He feared that any leak of his location would result in a NATO airstrike. His silence was part of a strategy. He wanted people to believe he might already be dead or somewhere else. Still, he had a plan. His goal was to break through the siege of Sirte and flee south, possibly towards Sabha, a city in the central desert, or even across the border into Niger, where other members of his government had already escaped. But every exit route was blocked by rebel forces. Roads were being watched. Convoys heading out of the city were either attacked or turned back. With no way out and no safe place to hide, Gaddafi's group became more desperate. They started sleeping in shifts. Some fighters stood guard while others rested. They used sandbags and debris to shield entrances to buildings and hide vehicles from drone view. Still, their movement was limited, and the constant bombing made life harder each day. By mid-October, it was clear that Gaddafi could not hold out in Sirte much longer, and on October 19th, Gaddafi made the decision to try to escape. He and his remaining inner circle began preparing to leave that night. The plan was to form a convoy of more than 50 vehicles, mostly pickup trucks and SUVs. Many were fitted with mounted machine guns or anti-aircraft weapons. Some carried weapons and ammunition, while others were filled with guards and Gaddafi's personal staff. Among those in the convoy were Muammar Gaddafi, Abu Bakr Yunus Jaber, Mansour Dao, Gaddafi's chief of security, and several senior military officers. A few family members were also present. The escape plan was risky. To avoid detection, the convoy planned to leave under the cover of night. Around 8 p.m. on October 19th, they began moving out from a hidden location in the city. The vehicles traveled without headlights, trying to stay hidden between buildings and under trees. They hoped the darkness would shield them from the air. Their goal was to reach the outskirts of Sirte, then follow a desert route southwest towards Wadi Zamzam, and from there towards Sabha, where they would attempt to cross into Niger or Algeria. However, unknown to them, NATO surveillance drones had been watching Sirte continuously for weeks. American and French intelligence had been monitoring unusual movements in the area, looking for signs that Gaddafi might try to flee. That same night, a U.S. MQ-1 Predator drone, flying above Sirte, picked up heat signatures showing a convoy forming and moving out of the city. In the early morning hours of October 20th, as the convoy reached the western outskirts of Sirte, it was spotted again, this time more clearly. Around 8:30 a.m., NATO made its final move. A U.S. Predator drone, controlled from outside Libya, launched a Hellfire missile directly at the convoy. The missile hit one of the lead vehicles as it moved slowly along the western edge of Sirte. That strike immediately halted the front of the convoy. Just minutes later, French Mirage fighter jets flying over the area dropped laser-guided bombs on the rear of the convoy. Multiple vehicles exploded in flames. The attack hit both ends of the convoy, trapping those in the middle and sending the rest into panic. Gaddafi's security guards and fighters tried to respond, but they were outgunned and exposed. Some of the vehicles were destroyed instantly. Others flipped or crashed as drivers tried to escape the airstrikes. Dozens of loyalist fighters died on the spot. Many of the survivors jumped out and ran toward the nearby unfinished buildings, open lots, and large concrete drainage pipe under the road. Gaddafi, Mutassim, Mansour Dao, and a small number of others survived the airstrikes and fled on foot. Covered in dust and blood, they slipped into the large round drainage pipe. The pipe was located just off the road, hidden by brush and debris. It was about 4 feet in diameter, just big enough for a man to crawl through. Inside, the group waited in silence, hoping to avoid being found. By that time, rebel fighters from Misrata had already moved into the area. They had been following the convoy's path for days and arrived shortly after the airstrike. The rebels were armed with rifles, grenades, and light machine guns. They began searching the area carefully, checking damaged vehicles, nearby buildings, and the surrounding land. It didn't take long before they noticed bloodstains and footprints near the road. A few followed the trail and spotted the drain entrance. They threw in a grenade first, expecting more guards to be hiding inside. Then they moved closer to inspect. That's when they saw Gaddafi, crouched inside. He was wearing brown pants, a blood-stained shirt, and a flak vest. His hair was matted, and his face was covered in blood and dirt. He had injuries on his left arm, back, and right leg, most likely from the blast and debris during the airstrike. They pulled him out into the sunlight. He stumbled, barely able to walk. Mutassim Gaddafi, also wounded but still standing, was captured moments later with Abu Bakr Yunus Jabr, who was seriously injured. A few others tried to flee from the surrounding area, but they were either shot or captured on the spot. Mansour Dao was among those taken alive. He later confirmed that the group had been trying to escape to Sabha when the airstrike hit. The rebels dragged Gaddafi to a nearby road. They sat him down and placed him in the back of a pickup truck. By now, more and more fighters had gathered. News of Gaddafi's capture had spread quickly over radios and phones, and many rushed to the scene. As the truck moved slowly, people began hitting him with sticks, fists, and gun butts. Some pulled his hair and yanked at his clothes. Others shouted insults, some of them referencing the years of dictatorship, torture, and bombings Libyans had endured under his rule. A few fighters climbed into the back of the truck to get closer to him. There was little control over the situation. Multiple videos later shared across the world showed Gaddafi slumped over, bleeding heavily from the head and midsection. At some point, he tried to sit up, but was forced back down. The violence continued for several minutes as the truck tried to move through the narrow roads packed with armed fighters. The exact moment of his death remains unclear. According to medical reports, he had been shot in the head and abdomen. Some say he was shot during the struggle in the truck. Others believe a fighter may have pulled the trigger deliberately. There was no official trial, no announcement of a formal execution, and no confirmation of who fired the fatal shot. What is certain is that by the time the truck left the outskirts of Sirte and reached an NTC-controlled checkpoint, Muammar Gaddafi was dead. His body was covered in blood, his shirt torn, and his pants soaked. He had multiple gunshot wounds and bruises across his body. The doctors who later examined him confirmed that he died around 1 p.m. on October 20th, 2011, at the age of 69. His body was taken to the city of Misrata, which had suffered deeply during the war. For 3 days, his body was kept inside a refrigerated meat locker in a local market, under the control of Misrata's militia. People lined up in the hundreds to see it. Many took photos or recorded videos. It was a moment of closure for some, and revenge for others. The bodies of Mutassim Gaddafi and Abu Bakr Yunus Jabr were also brought to Misrata. Both men had died shortly after capture, Mutassim from a gunshot wound to the neck and chest, and Jabr from injuries suffered during the convoy attack. On October 23rd, just 3 days later, the NTC officially declared the end of the civil war. After over 8 months of conflict and more than 30,000 deaths, Libya was now under new leadership. Once the public viewings ended, the question of Gaddafi's burial became urgent. On the night of October 25th, 2011, Gaddafi was buried in a remote desert location somewhere in western Libya. To this day, the precise burial site remains unknown to the public. Gaddafi's end was violent, but it reflected the kind of rule he had maintained for years. Even after his death, many questions remained. Who ordered the final shot? Why wasn't he tried in court? Could his capture have ended differently? But for many in Libya, it didn't matter. His death marked the close of an era.